Hello cellists, let's talk about the Lutoslawski cello concerto. Here, Lutosławski uses a few elements that we are usually not seeing in other works. So we have the quarter tones and aleatoric elements. The word aleatory comes from Latin. Alea is dice in Latin, and it is music in which elements of the composition are left to chance or to the determination of the performer. We start with a long introduction. It's sort of a cadenza, which is strange because usually we see cadenza at the end of the first movement of a concerto. Here it opens the piece. I think of this work as a tragic comic. If you know that play Waiting for Godot, here there are some parallels. In the beginning, not much is happening. We're just playing an open D. I think of it as being an actor. When I play it, I think of really looking indifferent. You can look to the side or somehow project indifference, which is also very atypical. We usually want to look very involved with what we're performing. Also similarly to Waiting for Godot, the protagonist or protagonists in Godot, they talk, but we can't really understand what they're saying. And similarly here, we don't understand what the cello is saying. I don't understand it, at least. After this opening introduction, we have 4 episodes separated by interjections of the brass, and then we have this beautiful cantilena played by the cello and a finale. We are used to having rehearsal numbers in our parts and in the orchestra score, and like their name implies, they are for rehearsing. In this concerto, rehearsal numbers are actually performance numbers, and each of them indicates a meeting place between orchestra, conductor, and soloist. Since a lot of this music is not measured exactly, and as such not aligned between the instruments, Lutoslawski shows us, the soloist and the conductor, where to meet. So every time you see a number in the score, this means you have to check in with your conductor to be sure he or she are there with you. This is very important. Sometimes you might have to adjust something, or they will. But you can definitely fall apart if you ignore those meeting points and just plow forward. Let's talk about the quarter tones. On the page is very intimidating. I've talked to people who said I wouldn't even know how to start approaching this work. Well, it looks intimidating, but in fact it's not really one of the hardest pieces, believe it or not. So the way I practice the quarter tones is I find the non-quarter tones, I find the regular tones. So let's look at the 4th line from the top, and here we have a D and C sharp. Those are both normal quote-unquote notes. And then we have the C sharp plus, and then the D with the little sharp. So I find the D and the C sharp, and then I find the note in between. And I'm always making sure that the sharps that are really not quite as sharp, but a quarter tone above, are not a D sharp, but just close enough to the D that they don't sound like a D sharp. So it's not, you get used to this. You really do get used to hearing that, but you have to train your ear. Let's talk about tempo. The tempo here it looks free because there's no bar lines, at least in the cadenza, but I believe that you have to, first of all, be very strict and subdivide the smaller notes to find their true value. Only then you can take liberties. So if we have 5/16 notes equals 60, that's about... So if I want to find out how fast to play the 32nd notes, I just double that. So instead of I play and then translate it to passages that don't have that 5 unit, that don't fit into the 60 beats per minute. So for example, if we look at the 2nd page of the solo part, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th line from the top, we have a dotted 16th note followed by 4 30 seconds notes. So the way to practice this for me would be first go back to the 5/16 notes equal 60 beats per minute, which is... Then find your 30-second notes. So if this is a unit, then we have 3 of those 30-second notes. And then... So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. And this should be the ratio of those notes. So now I don't know that you can practice this with a metronome, but always go back to that 60 beats per minute. Find your 16th note, calculate your 30-second notes, and then go from there. When we reach the pianissimo in that second page, here again the technique to practice those quarter notes. That's a good place to start practicing your quarter notes. You find the B, you find the B flat, and then you find the middle. Again, go to G sharp, you find your A, and then find the middle. This whole passage, these 2 lines right there, I would keep my bow on the string. There's just not enough time to lift it and land it back. And so you just pronate with your first finger and release the pressure between those groups. Another thing that can help you feel grounded in terms of tempo is to just use very simple math. And if 5/16 notes equal 60 beats per minute, then a quarter is 75 beats per minute. And wherever you see 4 notes, a group of 4 notes, you can try to fit that into 75 beats per minute. Another idea is to find those groups of 5. So for example, 4th line from the top of page 2 in the solo part, we have a group of 5 notes. It doesn't look on the page like it's 5, but if you count the 16th notes, they are in fact 5, so they should all fit within 1 second. So so the way I practice it is, so I fill in the gaps, I fill in the rests so that I feel it more measured. And then I add the grace notes. And then... And you can do that with a metronome if you wish. The following line, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 from the top, I actually subdivide it in 2. So starting from the group of 5 notes here. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. So here I think of those B flats as being in groups of 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Lutoslawski does that a few times throughout the concerto. He stretches the tempo. He writes his ritardando. He very controlled writing, and you can already see it in the second line of the concerto, where the first rest is a 32nd note rest, and then a 16th, and then an 8th, a dotted 8th, and finally a quarter. So in other words, the gaps are just getting gradually bigger, and if you really want to calculate it, it doesn't add up to quite 2 seconds, but the idea is that the silences between the notes grow longer. For this piece, I highly encourage you to use the iPad, because otherwise you will have a spread of 4 pages open, and it's not easy to read that. It doesn't look that great from the audience point of view. I would also encourage you to write cues in your part. For example, in rehearsal 26, AR means harp, and it's good to translate those to understand what the hell that means. The little cues I have are for 30 to be with a conductor, to look at the conductor, for example. Right at 29 or before 29, there's a flute and pizzicato in the strings. At 39, you have to wait for a sign, stuff like that. That will really make it easier to follow what's happening. A couple of misprints or omissions in our cello part. Rehearsal 42, the 8th equals 168. In rehearsal 32, pay attention to the orchestra. They come in exactly at rehearsal 32. You have to be clear rhythmically so that your conductor can follow you. Ad lib here means this cello solo does not need to be aligned with the orchestra, but it does not mean, however, that you should go crazy with rubato. The pulse should stay more or less constant at 32, and 33 is again tight with the orchestra. So the same thing happens again and again. For example, between rehearsal 34 and 35, we're again tightly aligned with the orchestra. In other words, the ad lib indications are only good until the next rehearsal numbers are indicated. From rehearsal 35 to rehearsal 37, we are tight with the orchestra. So practice this section with the metronome. In rehearsal 45, each beat, i.e. every second, corresponds to an entrance in the orchestra, in different sections of the orchestra. So be sure you give those glissandi their full volume. Also, your conductor will love you if you give them a very clear upbeat 30-second note upbeat to rehearsal 71. It's not easy to follow. The cello part is definitely not easy to follow. Similarly, the A natural and G sharp eighth notes before rehearsal 72 should be clear. Conductor starts conducting, as you see with the arrow is pointing to where the conductor starts conducting. So you should also know that, anticipate that. The notation before rehearsal 76 can be misleading. We have a fermata over the low E, and it does not mean that the E, 3, 4, 5, that the E is elongated. It means that this whole section is under one big fermata. I believe that the ratio 4-1 still holds, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, until the next entrance is given by the conductor. One of the hardest passages in this work starts at rehearsal 96. As you can see, there are groups of 4 notes under those long slurs, so I think of them as so I give a little oomph on the beginning of each 4 notes, so it is a little easier for the conductor to follow. At rehearsal 104, there's a little misprint in the cello part. The first A in this bar is an 8th, not a 16th note. You can compare with the score and you'll see what I'm talking about. So it's a little longer on the A. This makes this group of notes, the second group of notes on the page, different than the first. So it's not. So it's a little longer on that A. By the way, there is one more misprint in the cello solo part, which is more obvious. It is a missing 16th rest just before the very last note in the concerto. And both of these misprints are indicated correctly in the orchestral score, as I mentioned. A final misprint that I wanted to mention is at rehearsal 96. It is an 8th equals circa 168. It's not a 16th, it's an 8th. And you can, again, compare with the score. Notice the fingerings around rehearsal 105, 106. I like to keep the same finger for the same note to keep intonation constant, if possible. So starting second line from the top, we have a G flat, and then G 3/4 flat, and then we are on the 4th finger for the G 3/4 flat. So I keep that 4th finger. So, and here we are on the 3rd finger for the F. Here there's a position change. And again, we stay in the same position. And from here, I go step by step down on the 4th. So I shift my hand on each of those groups. But it is nice sometimes to not change position so that you can try and really match the same note to the same finger intonation-wise. I hope that's clear. Rehearsal 114 is again really tricky. there's a lot of noise happening in the orchestra. So, I don't know that it's a huge priority to practice your heart out on this one if you're tight on time. But when we look at those groups of notes, there's 10 notes in each group, and I divide them to 5 groups of 2 so that it's easier to hear. As you notice, the last 2 of each 10-note group is the same. So there's no change. And again, the last 2 of the second group are again the same, and that reverses later. The fingerings that Rostropovich wrote are, I think, very, very good because, his hand is very big, so he can really stretch. So that's not super practical for people like me that don't have a big hand. But what I do like about it is the division here is to 2 and 3. So you have 2 groups of 2 notes and then 3 groups of 2 notes each. So it's 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, and again 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. And that really helps the conductor hear that group and know when to put his next beat. And this is how it sounds when it's fast. You're going to end up faking a little bit, but it's good not to fake when you practice, so that when you fake, it still sounds not totally sloppy. So and here, when you get to the 5/16 notes before rehearsal 116, remember to keep the same tempo. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Before we had 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, and here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That relationship is very important to maintain. So again, it's not a free-for-all tempo. The tempo has to be very solid for it to translate. Your audience is going to be able to tell if you're sloppy or if you're with a program.